Three German individuals created gestalt psychology. So how did it end up in the United States? And how did Kurt Lewin play a role? The answer to this question is in this image. Gestalt psychology came to the United States through these three individuals, the three founders of Gestalt psychology. All three of them moved to the United States in the 1930s, just before World War II started. Those of you who are interested in the history of World War II may find this interesting, and it may be something that you already know. For those of you who are less familiar with World War II, you must know that the Nazi regime began to make changes many years before the war started in 1939. The United States entered the war in 1941, but it had been going on for at least 2 years before we entered, and the drastic changes, the actions against Jewish individuals began as early as the late 1920s, early 1930s. One of the things that happened early on happened in April of 1933. Adolf Hitler signed his law for the reestablishment of the professional civil service. The law terminated all Jewish professionals from state-funded roles. Now, at the time, state-funded meant something different than it means today. There were many more roles funded by the government in Germany at that time. It included a lot of people. Many, many, many people lost their jobs as a result of this law. And it was a symbol of what was yet to come. As soon as this law was put into place, we start to see large numbers of individuals leave Germany. Many of these individuals practiced Judaism. Some of these individuals were not of Jewish ethnicity or of Jewish faith. Both Kafka and Wertheimer were Jewish. Kafka had left in 1927 for job opportunities. He moved to Massachusetts that year, not necessarily because he was worried about what was happening in Germany, more for the job opportunities. However, once things started to change in Germany, Kafka realized that he would probably not be going back in his lifetime. In 1933, that same year that Hitler signed his law, Wertheimer and Lewin both lost their jobs and had to find work elsewhere. The United States seemed like a safer place. Psychology had a following in the United States, and so they both felt like it would be a good opportunity for them. They both ended up moving to New York. In 1935, Kuhler left Germany to come to the United States. And I added this last bullet point into this slide to show you just how many individuals left Germany during this time. Sigmund Freud and Anna Freud are both associated with the history of the treatment of mental illness. They both had a role in popularizing psychoanalysis, but both of them were also Jewish. And so in 1938, just before the war began in Germany, both Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna left and ended up in the United Kingdom. Kurt Lewin is an extremely important psychologist. He had an influence on social psychology, applied psychology, and also is one of the reasons why Gestalt psychology came to the United States. He was a German social psychologist. He was also born into a Jewish family. He mainly promoted applied psychology. It's interesting that he gets credited with bringing Gestalt psychology, but didn't really study Gestalt psychology. One of the reasons why he's associated with Gestalt psychology is because, big surprise, he earned his PhD from the University of Berlin and studied with Carl Stumpf, the same individual who taught the other three founders of Gestalt psychology. He also gets associated with Gestalt psychology because he was friends with the three founders. After he served in World War I, Lewin worked with Wertheimer and Kuhler at the Psychological Institute. He also became friends with Kafka. So he was surrounded by 3 gestalt psychologists. He learned from the person who taught them, Stumpf. He had a lot of experience studying perception, learning, memory, problem solving. While he was at the Psychological Institute, he established a research program. Anytime you start a research program, one of the very first things you have to do is get funding and recruit graduate students. He was very good at doing this. He eventually developed an international reputation. Remember, he started in Germany, but eventually becomes one of the most famous social psychologists in the United States. Cornell University became interested in Lewin and his work and hired him in 1933. After he came to the United States, he changed the pronunciation of his last name. Technically, his last name is pronounced Levin. The W in German has a V sound, Levin. So he decided to change his last name to Lewin to make it easier for people to contact him. He actually missed a few phone calls and missed a few messages because people kept asking for Professor Lewin. Compared to the 3 founders of Gestalt psychology, Lewin was much more interested in motivation than he was interested in perception. Nonetheless, their ideas influenced much of what he studied and many of his theories that he proposed. Lewin tended to look at psychology from a big picture perspective. Lewin was one of the first people to say, shouldn't we be paying attention to the other things that are going on around an individual, the people they're surrounded with, the events in their life, the obstacles, the motivators? Shouldn't we be paying attention to that information as well? Shouldn't we be looking at the big picture instead of just one piece of that picture? His field theory is a good example of how Gestalt psychology influenced his ideas. According to his field theory, we have to have information about the person, the P, and the environment, the E in the formula. Human behavior, therefore, is a function of the things going on inside of the person, as well as the things going on in the environment. Behavior is a function of the person and the environment. This is an illustration of Lewin's field theory. Let's apply it to your life to give you a better understanding of what he was talking about. First, think about one of your goals. For instance, graduating with a decent grade point average. Now think about where you are today. In terms of how many classes do you have left? What is your current GPA? Do you have internships, practicums, clinicals that you still need to complete? In the image, we have where you are today on the left and where you'd like to be in the future on the right. The green lines and the arrows pointing toward the goal represent those things in your life that motivate you, inspire you, and help you reach those goals. Let's say you have a good friend who's always there to support you, always there to lift you up. Your friend might be considered one of these green arrows. You might have a really good job that you can depend on, that is flexible, that allows you to go to school but also pay your bills. That might be another green arrow. So think about all the different types of support that you have in your life. All of these things are helping you get from point A to point B, from today to tomorrow. Now, think about all the obstacles and the challenges you face on your way to reaching this goal. The COVID-19 pandemic would certainly qualify as one of these red arrows. All of these arrows are pushing against the individual. They're things in the environment that are making it difficult for the individual person to reach their goals. According to Lewin, we need to pay attention to the individual, the environment. We need to pay attention to the things that help us and the things that create obstacles in order to truly understand why we behave the way we do, why we choose a particular course of action. Lewin initiated and promoted a type of research called action research. He would conduct studies with the explicit goal of using the data to make changes, to make improvements in that situation. There were a number of studies that he and his students participated in the mid-1900s. They studied group loyalty within a group of Catholic college women and a group of Jewish college women. They also studied patterns of interracial housing. That was a topic that was not being covered by most individuals at the time. He also studied ways to train effective leaders. He looked at the different styles that leaders might use to determine which ones work best in which types of situations. Many psychologists still cite Lewin's original social psychology work in their articles today. What he did had a major impact on the entire field of psychology. I present him in this particular lecture because he was closely tied to the three founders and their supervisor. But technically, Lewin was a social psychologist.